I got a message that it is.
We're going live in 5, 4, 3. We are live.
Okay, and I'm going to admit everybody.
Okay.
Sure, you connect to audio.
Hey, you guys, this is Greg with Inspired Classroom. Everybody's coming into the meeting now. If you could all mute your microphones, that would be great. We're going to be meeting with 3 ambassadors here shortly. I'm going to turn it over to Chris for some introductions, and then we'll come back and talk about how we're going to moderate and get the questions to the ambassadors. Thanks. Go ahead, Chris.
Greg and Inspired Classroom, thank you very much, and welcome to our students in Montana, around the United States, and maybe even around the world. Thanks a lot for joining us on our 17th annual Academic WorldQuest. Chris Hislop here, the Executive Director from the Montana World Affairs Council. We're so pleased you could all join us this morning for this very extraordinary event. But before I introduce our guests, I'd like to thank our Academic WorldQuest sponsors: the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, First Interstate Bank, High Stakes Foundation, Qatar Foundation International, BNSF Foundation, Allegiance, Trail West Bank, Geisler Steel PC, the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center, the Good Food Store, the Montana World Trade Center, and Inspired Classroom. So as you know, students have had the opportunity to study the Middle East 10 years after the Arab Spring. This extraordinary panel of 3 U.S. ambassadors is going to give us their very unique perspective on those events, the differences in the countries, and the situation now 10 years on. Let me introduce our guests. Ambassador Ann Patterson is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and Ambassador to Egypt, Pakistan, Colombia, and El Salvador. Post-retirement, Ambassador Patterson has served on the Board of Advisors of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University, as President of the U.S.-Qatar Business Council, and on the Dow Jones Oversight Committee. She retired from the U.S. State Department with the rank of Career Ambassador after more than 4 decades in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Patterson also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, as well as Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, among other important assignments. In July 2017, Ambassador Patterson was also appointed to the National Defense Strategy Commission, charged by Congress with conducting a bipartisan and independent review of the country's national security needs. Ambassador Jerry Firestein retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in May 2016 after a 41-year career. At the time of his retirement, Firestein held the personal rank of Career Minister. Over the course of his career, he served in 9 overseas postings, including 3 tours of duty in Pakistan, as well as tours in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. In 2010, President Obama appointed Firestein the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, where he served until 2013. From 2013 until his retirement, Ambassador Firestein was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. In addition to his career-long focus on the Near East and South Asia, Firestein has also played a prominent role in developing and implementing State Department policies and programs to counter violent extremism. As Deputy Coordinator and Principal Deputy Coordinator in the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau, Firestein led the development of initiatives to build regional networks to confront extremist groups, as well as to counter terrorist financing and promote counterterrorism messaging. He continued to focus on defeating terrorist groups through his subsequent tours as Deputy Chief of Mission in Pakistan and as Ambassador to Yemen. Firestein joined the Middle East Institute in October 2016 as a Senior Fellow and the Director of a new Center for Gulf Affairs. In November 2018, he was appointed Senior Vice President by the MEI Board of Directors. Ambassador Gordon Gray is the Chief Operating Officer at the Center for American Progress. Prior to his retirement from the U.S. government after 35 years of public service, Ambassador Gray was the Deputy Commandant of the National War College. He was the U.S. Ambassador to to Tunisia from 2009 until 2012, witnessing the start of the Arab Spring and directing the U.S. response in support of Tunisia's transition. He served in Iraq as senior advisor to the ambassador, focusing on governance and infrastructure in the southern provinces. Before that, Ambassador Gray was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. His responsibilities included the promotion of U.S. interests in the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, and oversight of the Bureau's Regional Affairs Office. His other foreign assignments included Egypt, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission, Canada, Jordan, Pakistan, and Morocco, where he began his career in government as a Peace Corps volunteer. Before joining the Center for American Progress, Ambassador Gray was the Executive Vice President at the National U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce. I would like to thank the three ambassadors for joining us today, and now I hand it over to Ambassador Gray.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and particularly thank you for the invitation to speak to all of you in Montana or wherever else you may be. I'm going to say a few words about Tunisia, and I'd like to show you just a few slides, if I may. First of all, just to orient people who aren't familiar with exactly where Tunisia is, it's on the north coast of Africa, as you can, in the Mediterranean, just across from Sicily. And to give you an idea of Tunisia's size compared to that of Montana, Montana is about twice the size of Tunisia. This is a photograph of the massive demonstrations in the capital of Tunisia, Tunis, on January 14th, 2011. This was the day that massive demonstrations throughout the country, not just in Tunis, forced the longtime dictator Zinedine Ben Ali to flee with his family into exile. The demonstrations were peaceful. I'd like to draw your attention to the sign that says "Game Over," which is notable for two reasons. One is that English is not widely spoken in Tunisia, where Arabic is the mother tongue and French is widely spoken. But the reference to video game parlance reflects the nature of the revolution. It was very much a revolution inspired by young people. The demonstrations in Tunisia began shortly after the self-immolation of a fruit vendor in the center of the country. That happened on December 17th, 2010, and they quickly spread throughout the country. This is the leader of the country and his wife, Leila Trabelsi, who, as I said, were forced into exile. They fled to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, never to return to Tunisia, and Ben Ali died in exile about a year and a half ago. And I'd like to just give an idea of why this happened in Tunisia, but also because I think the contributing factors in Tunisia were also contributing factors to demonstrations, protests, revolution, civil war that we saw elsewhere in North Africa and the Middle East. And they also explain some of the demonstrations that continue to this day, be it in Algeria, they've just resumed, Sudan in 2019, Lebanon, et cetera. The first factor I'd like to highlight is alienation. In other words, the sense of distance that most Tunisians felt from their government. And this quotation is from a book that was written in 1993, but I think it was still relevant in 2011 when the uprisings began. And the conditions of dependency, underdevelopment, patriarchal and authoritarian relationships, social and political fragmentation, class distinctions, successive historical defeats, and a generalized state of repression have rendered the Arab people and society powerless. A second contributing factor was the freer flow of information within the Middle East and North Africa. In Tunisia, the government very tightly constricted or restricted the press. Most of social media was censored, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that was not censored was Facebook. And this photograph actually was taken in Tahrir Square in Cairo shortly after the demonstrations began there, January 25th, 2011. A third contributing factor in Tunisia and elsewhere in the region was the youth bulge. It's a very high percentage of the populations that were under the age of 25. They were saw that life could be better elsewhere, and they just, partly because of greater exposure to other countries, partly because of higher education levels, they had a much higher aspirations, which they did not feel were being met. And a fourth and important contributing factor, unfortunately, is it was and remains corruption. And it was certainly a factor in Tunisia, where you saw on Sakhr al-Matri was Ben Ali's son-in-law and had a very high percentage of business contracts due to the fact that he was son-in-law. His nephew, Laila Trabelsi's, on Laila Trabelsi's side, was another person who was widely considered to be corrupt. But this wasn't unique to Tunisia. This is a picture of Ben Ali, Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen, Gaddafi of Libya, Mubarak of Egypt. And in each case, either in Ben Ali's case, his son-in-law, or for the three other, in the case of the three others, their sons were all very heavily suspected to be corrupt and enriching themselves because of their who their father-in-law was. Just as an aside, these four dictators had among them 129 years of authoritarian rule, and they were both they were all kicked out of their positions of power, in Gaddafi's case, killed by the end of 2011. Let me just end, though, by with this quotation: poverty and unemployment exist everywhere. This happened because of a loss of dignity and a lack of dialogue. I heard this from a Tunisian member of civil society who joined the National Unity Government shortly after the revolution. And it stuck with me because it's one of the best explanations that I had of why there was an uprising in Tunisia. And I think it's an excellent reminder of the importance of dialogue and mutual respect. I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions.
thank you very much. And it was great to be invited, the Montana World Affairs Council and WorldQuest. And let me compliment the organizers on the readings too. I thought particularly like the 10 characteristics of the Arab Spring, which probably applied to Egypt more than any other country. So many of these things, the elements that Ambassador Gray certainly existed in Egypt, and let me start there. The Egyptians followed Tunisians to the street in 2011 almost immediately, but frankly, the turmoil in Egypt had been years in coming. And maybe it's helpful to review the timeline. When the demonstration started in the center of Cairo, the young people in Tahrir Square were publicized all over the world, and there was great hope, unrealistic hope, that the Arab world would become democratic. The demonstrators demanded that President Hosni Mubarak step down. He was removed by the military shortly thereafter. The military came into power for a year. The Muslim Brotherhood elected a president. He was overthrown by the military after a year. So the democratic experiment in Egypt lasted almost exactly 1 year. But let me step back and go through some of the causes of the Arab Spring, like Ambassador Gray did. I personally believe the big driver in Egypt was economic. I came to this conclusion when I was ambassador and talked to a number of the people involved. And during the past 20 years, Egyptian universities had turned out lots of students who had been the first in their families to go to college. But when they graduated, they couldn't find any jobs because their education hadn't prepared them for the modern labor force. In Egypt, unemployment was higher among university graduates, far higher than any other group. And an unemployed young man couldn't get married, couldn't buy an apartment. And unemployment among educated young women was incredibly high, like 70 or 80%. And the second cause, I believe, is also a variant of what Ambassador Gray said, was there was a very rich group of individuals had arisen in Egypt in the few years before Tahrir Square. President Mubarak was 82 years old. He was old and frankly increasingly out of touch. For the average citizen, traffic was horrible, services had gone down, infrastructure was declining. But his two sons had embarked on a program of economic reform, which had some economic successes, but produced a group of rich men who lived large. And nightclubs were open, expensive restaurants, limos in the center of town. So I think the perceived corruption of Mubarak and his sons was one of the main drivers, and it caused the most resentment. And you would hear Egyptians talk unrealistically, frankly, that if the Mubarak family just returned its ill-gotten gains, they'd all have a better life. And then there's the role of the Egyptian military, and this is where Egypt does, I think, diverge from Tunisia. Hosni Mubarak had been an Air Force general when he took over after Anwar Sadat was assassinated, but he'd been in power for 29 years. He was planning to have his son succeed him. Well, the military didn't like this because they didn't like his son. They didn't like the reforms that I just mentioned. And I think more importantly, they didn't like some of his Western educated ministers who were going to curtail some of the military's power and money. So when the crowds in the street demanded that Mubarak step down, Egypt's military leadership didn't think that was such a bad idea. And in other words, there were other causes like police brutality, and maybe we can discuss that, but I think these were the three main drivers in Egypt. So why didn't some kind of democratic system take hold in Egypt? Americans wanted to think that all these young people in Tahrir Square would coalesce around a new democracy, and someone like Mohammed al-Baradei, who'd been head of a major UN organization, could take the helm. But the fact is, the people in Tahrir Square who actually represented a democratic movement were very few. None of the student groups or non-governmental organizations had any experience in forming a political organization. And there was no real effort to form one during the transition. The military took over and violent demonstrations continued for months. The US and many Egyptians pressed for quick elections. A series of elections were held for parliament and president. The Egyptian military was willing to hand over power because they were pretty sure they could govern behind the scenes. particularly if a former military officer or another government official well known to them was elected president. Well, instead, the Muslim Brotherhood was elected, Mohammed Morsi, in 2021. And it was elected, the party was elected because it was the only really organized political force in the country. It had a nationwide organization and had been providing services in the rural area for decades. I saw many examples when I was there of the organization of the Brotherhood. One day I went up to a polling place and I saw trucks let out dozens of women who were dressed head to toe in black from the rural areas to vote, just like parties here get their supporters out to vote. So that when free elections were held, the Muslim Brotherhood was by far the most organized party, and they won. And I also think Westerners sort of generally underestimate the Islamic tradition in Egypt, because in the first election, Islamists won 72% of the vote. The Muslim Brotherhood, everyone knew the Muslim Brotherhood would do well, but it was actually the Salafis, who are an even more conservative branch of Islam, who won over 22% of the vote. Well, problems started with Morsi almost from the beginning. He was a political loyalist, party loyalist with no political experience. Unfortunately, more senior people had been disqualified because of technicalities or previous convictions. He tried to rush through a revision of the Constitution. He picked fights with the military. He did stupid things like appoint one of the assassins of Sadat, who'd just been released from jail, as one of the governors. He couldn't settle on any economic policies. And he came under pressure from the business community and from the army. And as he became under pressure, he increasingly isolated himself. So maybe I'll stop there. Let me make another point. Two enemies that the US government underestimated were the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because it appeared after the fact that they had basically offered the army billions of dollars, if not to overthrow President Morsi, at least to nudge him out as quickly as they can. These countries were very apprehensive about a upsurge in political Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood in their own country. And then at this point, services began to decline. Egyptians were very tired of constant demonstrations and labor unrest. Workers who had anticipated that life would get better after Mubarak left were disappointed. So Morsi began to lose favor, and he was overthrown by the military in July of 2013. And we can talk about the aftermath and where we think that's going, perhaps in the discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you, Gordon, and most of all, thank you, Montana World Affairs Council, and all of the students who've joined us in this program today. I just want to say, of course, Gordon laid out a number of common themes, common issues that motivated the uprising, particularly the youth in 2011, and also, but also to make the point that I believe Ann made, which is that although there are many common factors that were driving these demonstrations, each of these countries followed a trajectory that was unique to their own history, their own tradition, their own culture. And that very much was the case in point in Yemen in 2011 and 2012. I always refer to the Arab Spring and the subsequent developments in Yemen as the continuation of a 60-year conflict. The reality is that in the 1960s, the Sunni majority population of Yemen rose up against what had been up until that time a Zaydi Shia theocracy called the Imamate, which had governed the country for hundreds of years in the north. And keeping in mind also that Yemen at that time was divided between North Yemen, which was ruled by the Imamate, and South Yemen, which was basically suzerainty under the control of the United Kingdom. And so each of those parts of Yemen followed their own path. There was an uprising against the British in the south, which eventually succeeded in pushing the British out and establishing what was and remains until this day as the only crypto-Marxist government in the entire Middle East. It was called the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. In the north, after 10 years of civil war, the majority Sunni population succeeded in forcing out the imamate, which interestingly enough was supported at the time by not only Iran but also by Saudi Arabia. But the majority population forced them out with the help of Egypt and established the Yemen Arab Republic. And the two halves of Yemen went forward for a number of years in that profile, in that posture, and conflicting with one another. But neither of them ever succeeded in actually achieving a real state of stable governance in their half of the population. And both sides suffered from what I believe were the major causes also of the 2011 uprising. And those were a long history of political disenfranchisement, economic marginalization, and social distancing and sectional differences. Not sectarian necessarily, because the Zaydi Shia and the Shafi'i Sunni were not sectarian oriented. They were both relatively moderate sects in their own religion, but there were deep sectional differences between the North and the South that were papered over when the two sides came together to form the United Yemen in 1990. And those issues were never resolved. There was a civil war in 1994, and there were a series of coups, attempted coups, uprisings, and assassinations all through the history of Yemen. In 2011, influenced by developments elsewhere, by developments in Egypt, by developments in Tunisia, and I think that importantly, as Gordon pointed out, there was a great deal of communication back and forth among these young people who were talking to one another. They were Skyping, they were using WhatsApp, they were using a number of different media to communicate and to take lessons from each other of what was working and what wasn't working. And so the demonstrations against Ali Abdullah Saleh started in February of 2011 and culminated several months later. There is one other social aspect of the history of Yemen that's important here, and that is that Yemen, being primarily a tribal society, and in that sense, much different from Tunis, much different from Egypt, being a tribal society, there is a long history of turning to outside parties to help mediate disputes. If two tribes get into a fight over land or over other resources or any other issue, they will often bring in somebody from the outside to help settle their differences and to move on. And that's basically what happened in 2011 with the Arab uprising, recognizing that the society was divided and that neither the pro-Saleh nor the anti-Saleh movement could succeed in forcing an overthrow as they did in Tunisia, as they did in Cairo. There was a decision by the political leadership on both sides to ask outsiders to come in. A number of embassies in Sana'a, including the embassies representing the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, including the US, as well as several of the GCC embassies and the European Union came in and started working with the two parties to put together a mediated settlement of the dispute. And then eventually the United Nations came in and provided a great deal of technical expertise in structuring what was and still is the only roadmap for a political resolution to the conflict that any of the states achieved prior to the resignation of the president. Ben Ali fled from Tunis. Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down, but Ali Abdullah Saleh was able to negotiate his departure from office with his political opposition, with the assistance of the outside parties. And what was formed afterwards was a government that was a political transition government with a new president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, and a ministerial system, a parliamentary system that was built around drawing members equally from both the pro-Saleh and the anti-Saleh political parties. Unfortunately, they were unable to rule effectively. The political transition stalled. Unfortunately, there was a long national dialogue conference that was intended not only to work out the details of the political transition, but also to try to address many of these long-standing issues, the issues, again, of political disenfranchisement and economic marginalization, to reform the military and security services, to undertake a number of different structural reforms in Yemen that would allow the country to be placed on a more sustainable, more stable footing. Unfortunately, what happened in 2013, 2014 is something that, again, is part of a long tradition, a long history in Yemen, and that is that despite the efforts of well-meaning people to negotiate a transition, to negotiate an agreement for how to govern, how to rule, the lack of institutional capacity, the lack of any real structure in the government of Yemen led those efforts to fail. And unfortunately, the situation turned back to violence, the beginning of the civil war in September of 2014, when the Houthis, who represented many of the Zaydi Shia, attacked Sana'a, overthrew the government of Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, and unfortunately triggered the civil war that continues until this day. So let me stop there.
Greg, you're on mute.
Thanks, Chris, for that. I was just saying, wow, we're in for an incredible hour of questions and answers here going on. Ambassadors, that was an awesome introduction. Thank you very much. So students, I know you guys have been a part of the program so far. Most of you have all, I've seen a lot of familiar names. So here's how we're going to do this. You can put your questions in the chat, and then as long as you have your video on, I will come to you and ask you to be ready, and I'll try to give you time to make sure that you're ready in the order that we're going in, so that you can come up and be ready to ask your question. But I'd like to give you guys, students, the opportunity to verbally answer or ask your questions, but let's be putting them in the chat first before we do that. I see Gardner's got their hand up, and it looks like they're ready to ask a question. So as Gardner's asking their question, if the rest of you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll manage that way, and then I'll direct you guys to ask the question. So go ahead, Gardner, let's get this started.
All right, thank you. First, I'd just like to thank all the ambassadors for joining us today. It's truly what makes this academic WorldQuest, and not just about Montana or the United States, and especially in a year like this where travel has been so restricted, and this is truly a window into the greater world that we live in. Yesterday, we talked with Ambassador Spratlin, who had served in Uzbekistan, and she mentioned this situation that the United States is in, where there's times where we seem to hold different values depending on the situation. For example, the State Department is a beacon for democracy around the world, and at the same time, the United States provides authoritarian regimes with military aid. And I've been in debate for 4 years. This is my 4th year of WorldQuest, so I've done some research into these topics. And my question for you is, have you ever encountered pushback against this dueling values of the United States when you're working in these countries? And if so, what values do you present as a leader and as a beacon of democracy when you are dealing with these nations and trying to promote democracy?
So Ambassador, since that was just a general question, let's just go to the three of you and we'll stay in the same order. Ambassador Gray, if you want to start, and then we'll go to the other two ambassadors to get an answer to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great question, and it really goes to the heart of some of the issues that one has to deal with in a government career. Certainly, in my case, well, for all three of us, we served in mostly in countries which were not exactly paragons of democracy, but in many cases were also important security partners. And it was important for us to simultaneously try and promote U.S. interests in the security realm, but at the same time promote U.S. interests and values and issues such as human rights. It's not always an easy needle to thread, but I think if one has credibility, it's possible to do. And for ambassadors, our credibility comes from Washington and what the policies are there. We are the ones who implement the policy. So to the degree that the policy is credible, that makes our lives a lot easier, or our jobs a lot easier, at least.
Say that this is a constant tension. This has been a constant tension. In my experience, actually, it was a bigger tension in places in Latin America where I was in El Salvador and Colombia and other countries I worked on, like Guatemala, where the tensions were really quite acute. And as Ambassador Gray says, you try to balance these. You try and tell people the truth. I think that's probably you try and be candid with the public and the place that you serve and with the leaders of the country and with human rights activists in those countries. But ultimately, we implement the policies of the President of the United States. So you are going to see shifts from time to time, and maybe the last 4 years have been sort of an aberration, but certainly from mainstream Republican and Democratic administrations, you also see shifts. But it's just a constant challenge. You get better at it, I think, with more experience, but it's there are never any easy answers to this.
Yeah, I certainly agree with both Gordon and Ann on this. I would recast the question a little bit, and perhaps what Ambassador Spratling was saying a little bit, in the sense that it's not a question of values versus realpolitik or whatever. It's a question of the United States being a country, a global power with a lot of responsibilities, a lot of interests, and those interests have to be balanced. And so the question is, how do you balance? In Yemen, the major U.S. interest up until the Arab Spring was really working with the Yemeni government on the issue of terrorism. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was the affiliate of Al-Qaeda in the world that was considered to be the most dangerous to the United States and to the world. And therefore, the United States emphasized in our relationships with the Yemenis that we were going to work with them to help them defeat this global jihadist entity. When the Arab Spring came along, there was a debate in Washington. There was a debate whether the United States should stick with the Ali Abdullah Saleh government because they had been our partners in this fight against Al Qaeda, or should we support the democratic movement that was seeking to change the dynamic and to perhaps introduce more open, more democratic, more tolerant governance there. At the end of the day, the administration decided that they were going to support the effort to change the government, recognizing, of course, and reflecting what was happening elsewhere in the Middle East, and a view at that particular moment that in fact the United States should throw in its support for these youth movements, these democratic movements. And that was a decision that we made in the direction we took. Fortunately, I think afterwards it proved that we could do both, that in fact the new government was as supportive and in many ways more supportive than the Saleh government had been in the fight against extremism. But there's always, as Ann said, there's always this tension between these things, but it is a tension that comes out of the fact that we have global responsibilities and global interests, and these have to be addressed in many different ways.
Okay, thanks, ambassadors, for that. Okay, we're going to go to Hellgate now, and Hellgate, if you can unmute and I'm sure you have your video on because it was on before.
Awesome. Okay, so my question is, how much Arabic do you guys speak? If you do speak a lot of Arabic, where did you have the opportunity to learn it? And how has Arabic opened doors or like helped you as an ambassador of an Arab country?
Okay, and again, since it's a general question to all three of you, we'll continue to stick in that same order. Thanks, ambassadors.
Sure. I learned Arabic in the Peace Corps. I was Peace Corps and volunteer in Morocco. And Arabic, as many of you may know, is it's, first of all, at least for Americans, it's a very difficult language to learn, but it's also a language in which the dialects are quite different from one another. The odds that if I had been miraculously transplanted from Morocco to Yemen, the odds that I could understand or be understood are pretty low. But I think also Arabs are very, with reason, very proud of their language, and so the fact that one shows that the fact that you as a foreigner are showing interest in their language and in their culture by trying to learn it opens a lot of doors and garners a lot of goodwill.
So I had a year of Arabic full-time in 1983. And on occasion, I had tried to go back, certainly before I went to Egypt, but unlike my two colleagues here, I couldn't speak Arabic in a functional way. And what that taught me was that you really, really need to. And what I've seen in the Foreign Service, because so many educated people speak English, that our language ability as diplomats has probably declined over the years. So I'm strongly of the view that people who go to the field need to have several years of Arabic. They need, most people who engage with foreigners in a political and economic sense need to speak the language really well.
Yeah, I agree. I took Arabic in the Foreign Service Institute, which is the facility in the State Department that provides language training and other professional development programs, has a 2-year Arabic language program that at the time that I took it, which was the 1980s, was based in Tunis. And so I spent 2 years in Tunisia studying Arabic there. It's changed since then. They no longer have a single facility, but reflecting what Gordon said, they try to send people out to different locations in the Middle East to learn the dialect of the posts where they're going to be assigned. Not only, for the most part, as Ann said, for the most part, especially if you're working in the Gulf, the chances are that the people that you're dealing with professionally are going to be English speakers. They've either studied in the United States or the UK or Canada, and they often would prefer to speak to you in English than in Arabic. Yemen was really the only posting that I went to where, in fact, the vast majority of the citizens, including those who were senior officials in the Yemeni government, didn't speak any language besides Arabic. And fortunately, they speak a very good Arabic. They're a very consistent Arabic that goes with our language training. So I use it a lot there, but let me make one other point, and that is that it's not only a question of your professional engagements, it's also how you relate to the society, how you feel about traveling around, because even in those places where English is widely spoken among the elite, if you get out of the city, out of the capital, and you're in the countryside or in smaller towns, chances are that you're going to be encountering a lot of people who don't speak any English. And just how you feel about that, how comfortable you are, is depending an awful lot on whether you feel like you can communicate. Can you read the road signs? Can you find your way to the restaurant or the train station? These are things that absolutely influence the quality of your experience in that society. And as Gordon said, the quality of how people relate to you. So absolutely, it was 2 years. It's not easy. It can be very stressful, but it is a wonderful investment if you can maintain it.
Okay, thanks, ambassadors. Now, Jacqueline, I know I said we were going to go to you next, but I think really, ambassadors, you're in for a little surprise here, because I'm going to put the kids in Hellgate who have another question in the chat on the spot, and I think they should probably share a little bit of their skills that we heard in the previous session. Come on, you guys.
مرحبا اسمي منيرة أنا درست عربية 4 سنين وأنا أيضا درست عربية ل4 سنين واسمي نور وفي الصوت اسمي نور اسمي جريس نعم نعم
Alan was Alan.
So ambassadors, I'm not sure. I think you guys and the teacher over there are the only ones that can tell whether they got to ask the question, their follow-up question or not, because I certainly don't speak Arabic. So did they get to ask their question? And if so, I think you should probably answer it in English for the benefit of all of us.
I think they were introducing themselves.
It was more on the introduction side.
Okay.
Hello, that's great. Yes.
Rex, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hello, I'm not an Arabic speaker. I just came to learn. I wanted to ask, do you sometimes wonder if resources spent on counterterrorism efforts would be better allocated to development? It's a big question.
Okay, again, let's just continue with the questions are general, so let's continue with the same format. You guys, this is great. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. I think I'd recast your very good question slightly differently and put it in terms of what the time frame is or what the horizon is. Sometimes in the shorter term, there's specific counterterrorism assistance, such as training or equipment that can be offered that's very useful. Both Ambassador Firestein and I worked at separate times in the counterterrorism office and worked with the anti-terrorism assistance program, which does exactly that. But I think in terms of having a successful long-term counterterrorism policy that's effective, you absolutely need to have addressed underlying causes, which oftentimes includes lack of development or underdevelopment. So I would agree with what I heard was the premise of your question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Ambassador Firestein has actually written a lot on this particular question, but let me say that, yes, you need to do both. But the first responsibility of any leader really is to protect the United States from attack. And I think for some of you who are younger, obviously, it's hard to remember the sort of psychological effects of the 9/11 attack. And I think there were really quite useful measures taken, as Ambassador Gray laid out, to improve the capacity of these countries, many countries that we worked with, to protect themselves first, but also to protect the United States and its allies through better training, through better intelligence coordination, through all kinds of measures that are worked. So you need to do both, but I actually agree that you certainly need to concentrate on longer term development programs, certainly in places like Yemen and Egypt, where the poverty level is extraordinarily high and job opportunities are very limited.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely true. I agree with both Gordon and Ann on this. The reality is that the United States has a responsibility to its own citizens first and foremost, to make sure that we can provide for the defense. I think that again, we can't distinguish between these two aspects. Again, these are not things that are in conflict with one another. They are aspects of a comprehensive strategy that we need to pursue. I had, when I was working in the Counterterrorism Bureau, my boss was a guy named Del Daly. He was a retired special operations aviator who had become the State Department coordinator for counterterrorism. And he always used to say that if you look at the counterterrorism approach, only the top 5% is the kinetic part. The top 5% is the part that everyone talks about. It's killing the bad guys. It's attacking the Islamic State or Al Qaeda or whatever. The other 95% is the development stuff that you're doing. It's building up the capacity of your local partners to take on these operations and these responsibilities themselves, recognizing that often it's their own populations that are suffering the most. For whatever threat that Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula posed to the United States, it was only a shadow of the threat that they're posing on a daily basis to Yemeni civilians. And so they have an interest in working with us. And then developing the society, building up the economy, building up the institutions, all important things, but recognizing at the same time that these are two different clocks. In the kinetic aspects of counterterrorism, often you're looking at something, a threat that's in front of you, that's imminent, that somebody is trying to put a bomb on a plane, that somebody is planning an attack on a facility, versus development, which is often long-term. You're talking about a time horizon of 10 years or 20 years before you can really see the payoff of those development investments. So that you have to keep these things in balance. You have to do both.
Okay, thanks, ambassadors. Okay, Jacqueline, we're going to go to you for your question.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Richardson. I'm from Bozeman, and I was going to ask, do you think the protests made any positive change or like genuine progress?
Okay, Jacqueline, do you want to ask one specifically, or do you want all, would you like to hear all three of them respond to the protests in their respective
It
experience?
was more general, so if whoever
Okay.
wants to respond.
All right, thanks.
Sure, I'll be happy to start. The protests definitely had a positive effect in Tunisia in the sense that the protesters were very clear in what they wanted. One of the popular chants during the protests, which spread not only throughout North Africa and the Middle East, but also was even used by Occupy Wall Street demonstrators, was "The people demand the fall of the regime." In Tunisia, the people got the fall of the regime in the sense that Ben Ali left and the government around him, the ruling party, fell. That's kind of the good news. The bad news was they did not have a more sophisticated consideration of what they wanted to follow once the regime fell. That's not a criticism. No one expected it would happen as quickly as it did, but as a result, there a number of issues remain. Now, politically, Tunisia's done very well as far as credible elections, peaceful transitions of power, writing constitution, but some of the economic issues that fueled the discontent remain problems and have not been resolved yet.
So if you ask people who followed Egypt that question, you get lots of different answers. But here's my answer, and I think the people who would say no, they've made no difference because Egypt now under President al-Sisi is more repressive than it was under President Mubarak. Economically, it's somewhat better off, but certainly politically, and from the standpoint of political freedoms, it's a lot worse off. But I personally don't agree with that. I don't think you can turn back the clock. And I think eventually what we'll see in Egypt, and it may be 5-10 years coming, because the underlying problems are basically the same. People don't have jobs, they don't have a political voice. The military is going to be upset with somebody sitting there for 30 years again. The problems are pretty much the same. So I would be very surprised if you didn't see another Tahrir Square erupt at some point in Egypt. My guess would be between 5 and 10 years. Other people say that for sure it's coming, but what you have to have is young people who don't remember as well the aftermath of Tahrir Square, i.e. another 10 years. But I don't think you can turn back the clock. I think it was a very, if not traumatic, dramatic demonstration of people power.
In Yemen, I would say that the answer is it's too early to tell. And I think like Gordon and like Ann, the good news is that the popular protests enabled a movement that overthrew a corrupt and sclerotic administration, a government that was strangling the society and preventing any kind of progress. All of that is positive. Unfortunately, that positive political transition has been stalled for the last 7 years by the civil war that Yemen is in. And whether or not the society is going to be able to pick up the pieces after the war is over and resume the movement towards a more open, more tolerant, democratic society is going to depend an awful lot on the circumstances that lead to an end to the war. It's going to be, as I'm sure all of you know, Yemen is suffering from a humanitarian catastrophe. The economy has collapsed. There is widespread malnutrition. Healthcare has disappeared. All of these things are going to be challenges that confront Yemenis for many years to come, and how they're going to manage this, and are they going to be able to come together as a society again and try to get back on track. It remains to be seen. The U.S. will have a big role to play if they're going to be successful.
All right, awesome. Thanks, ambassadors, for those answers. Okay, we're gonna go to James for a question.
Hi, I'm James. I'm from Bozeman. This is mainly a question for Ambassador Patterson, although this probably also applies to the others. You mentioned that in Egypt, one of the main problems was not having really many organized political parties. Do you think there's anything that can be done to improve the situation with that?
Well, no, not in the short run, because the current government, President al-Sisi, has ruthlessly suppressed any political organizing of any sort. My guess is, and this comes from also some academic studies, that there is still basically a rump organization of the Muslim Brotherhood in the rural areas, and that the Muslim Brotherhood could probably, even today, with all the arrests and repression, generate something like 25% of the vote. And this, of course, is the dilemma. The government says the only choice toward dictatorship is the Islamists, and yet they won't let the democratic parties form. So I don't see frankly, any short-term change in this at all.
Ambassador Gray or Firestein, would you like to add anything to that?
No, not from my perspective.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Columbia Falls, we're going to you.
All right, so this question is specifically for Ambassador Firestein. It is because Saudi Arabia currently has a large role in Yemen today. What kind of impact did they have on the transitional government you brought up that they were doing after the initial Arab Spring?
Well, the Saudis were actually important partners for us in the political transition. I worked very closely with my Saudi counterpart in the working out the mediation, working on what came to be called the GCC initiative, and so the Saudis played an important role in that. More significantly, of course, Saudi Arabia has been the dominant player in Yemen for many years, both economically and politically. There are millions of Yemeni guest workers in Saudi Arabia, and so an awful lot of the Yemeni economy is dependent on the ability of Yemenis to go find jobs in Saudi Arabia. And one of the big issues, of course, leading up to the kind of the collapse of the transition and the beginning of the civil war was a sense that the Saudis were distancing themselves from supporting the Hadi government, that they had become frustrated with what they saw as the failure of the Hadi government to really take hold of the situation, provide for law and order. And so that in some ways weakened the government and made them vulnerable when the Houthis attacked. I think, my own view is that as we look to an end to the conflict, which we believe that the Saudis support, and a post-conflict reconstruction, we need to understand that the success or failure of that reconstruction is going to depend very heavily on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going to have to lead in the reconstruction effort. They're going to have to provide a lot of the economic support that allows Yemen to get back up on its feet. They've said, for example, that if there is a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Yemen, they would support bringing Yemen into the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which would give Yemen important markets for their products and allow them to advance economically. So we need to keep Saudi Arabia on side with us. We need to continue to work with them and hopefully to make sure that they continue to be supportive of Yemen as we go forward.
Great. Thanks. Okay, Elizabeth at Capitol High School, you're next.
Would you be able to expand on the similarities and differences between the police brutality and governmental practices that sparked and the recent protests in the United States regarding police brutality and racial prejudices?
Go ahead, Ambassador Gray. I kind of saw you shaking your head. Yeah.
Sure. I would, just looking at Tunisia, I'd make a distinction between Tunisia pre-revolution and Tunisia post-revolution. Tunisia pre-revolution, the security forces acted with impunity. In my remarks, I had talked about the loss of dignity that so many people felt, and one of the reasons was because of police brutality, which wasn't just isolated. They weren't just isolated cases. It was very much government policy. Post-revolution in Tunisia, that has changed, which is not to say that there isn't police brutality in Tunisia, because there is. The difference is that there is, it's exposed, there's civil society organizations working to correct those practices, working for accountability. It's freely discussed in the media. There are protests against police brutality. All this would have been unimaginable when Ben Ali was still in power. So in some respects, there are similarities between what we've seen in the United States, particularly last year, but not only last year, where there have been well-documented cases of police excesses and police brutality. The similarity between the United States and Tunisia today is that there is accountability, that in both societies we're talking about these issues, and in both societies, I think the majority of people realize that these are problems, and they are problems that they are seeking to address.
So
Go ahead, Ambassador Patterson.
police brutality was a huge issue in the run-up to the Arab Spring as a cause of the Arab Spring. And I used to observe these police that would come in to handle demonstrations in front of the embassy, and they were ill-paid, ill-trained, had absolutely no leadership. And this isn't not to say that in the million-man in Ministry of Interior, which controlled all the police in Egypt, there weren't some good units. There were some good units, and we participated in training one. But the average guy on a beat, he was terrible. He was just terrible. And one time I asked now President Al-Sisi, I said, why don't you do something about this? Good grief, it's a terrible problem. And he said, you know, it's just too big a problem to tackle, which was very revealing, I thought. So I don't think you can really compare what I saw in Egypt, which is the worst police I ever saw anywhere, Latin America, Pakistan, et cetera, with an American police force. I mean, we certainly have, you know, we have misuse of police power. We have horrible things that happen in the United States, but there's just absolutely no comparison. The first week I was there, we had riots in front of the Israeli embassy and the Saudi embassy, and people started to throw rocks at the police, and the police picked up the rocks and started to throw them back. So that was sort of the level of professionalization. There's just no comparison with the police force in the U.S.
Police brutality was not an issue in Yemen, actually. Yemen has many problems, but police brutality was not among them.
Okay. All right. Graham at Gardner High School.
Thank you for your presence today. We really appreciate it. But my question is more specifically for Ambassador Patterson. So this year, one of the topics that we are researching is the idea of exploring peace in a world of conflict. An idea that I ran across several times while reading these articles was the presence of sexism within peace negotiations, and the idea that only about 8% of negotiators of peace treaties are women, and similarly only 3% of signatories. And so I was just wondering what exactly Ambassador Patterson's experience has been as a woman within this field.
Well, let's take the peace negotiations first. And I was literally just on a webinar with Stephanie Williams, who had been the negotiator in Libya on a very successful, hopefully continuing successful effort. So yes, that's absolutely true. There are few women negotiators with the UN or frankly with any of the agencies, but the bigger issue is the participation of women who are involved in that country in the negotiations. And I think in Yemen, and I know in Libya, where there are now basically quotas for female participation, and it's certainly what we've tried to promote now, because when you get a critical mass of women, the peace process is vastly more sustainable, which frankly was one of the positive elements in the peace process in El Salvador. So it's very important, and there are a lot of serious people working on this, and I hope we'll see more of this, more women participate as time goes on. As far as being the ambassador of the United States of America, let me be frank. During my career, as a colleague put it once, the American was the most important person in the room. So you, as the American ambassador and a female American ambassador, are pretty much sexless. You represent the United States of America, you represent the world's remaining superpower, and almost anybody in any country in the world is going to deal with you because of that reason, regardless of how they may feel about women.
Great, thanks. Okay, we're going to go to Bozeman High School, and Olivia's got a question.
Hi, I was just curious, with the establishment of a new transitional government in Libya, what measures should be taken to ensure that the elections that are supposed to take place in December of 2021 work towards establishing some democratic reforms? And based on your experiences, what can the United States do to help aid in this effort? Thank you.
Well, there are a few things I think the United States can and should do. One is hopefully the new Biden administration will have a more coherent and engaged Libya policy. Under the previous administration, there was on one hand, we would make official statements in support of the government recognized by the United Nations. On the other hand, unfortunately, then President Trump was calling General Haftar, who was in opposition to that government, in armed opposition to that government. Simultaneously, there were administration officials at the time saying that this was Europe's problem. If we want to see a positive result in Libya, we need to be engaged. We need to support the UN effort that, as Ambassador Patterson noted, has got great potential to be successful. And we also need to use our diplomatic clout with some of our friends who are unfortunately not being very helpful in Libya, specifically by providing arms in contravention to the arms embargo that has been decided upon.
Yes, I think that's true. And I had the advantage of just listening to this. The other thing we need to do is, and this was discussed, is reopen the US Embassy. because it's now operating from Tunis, and the ambassador has, I'm sure, done really important work, but it's very hard to do from a distance. And then I think, as Gordon says, the main thing here is to be more engaged with either an ambassador or a special envoy, and both, and to call out some of our friends on their flagrant violations of international law, but mostly to support the UN peace process, because it's going to need a huge coalescing of international support and consistent attention to succeed.
Yeah, I agree with all of those points. I agree absolutely on the need to reopen our embassy. That we have to be there. Visibility makes a difference. It matters when people know that you're there. When I was in Yemen, many of the foreign embassies closed up because of the political chaos and the security problems. And I can't tell you how significant it was for me to be able to go into the president and say, the United States is still here. We're still in our embassy. We're not leaving. People take notes. People observe who's there, who's going to work with them through their problems, and who's not. And the U.S. has to be part of the solution. We have to be present. The other point, and again, I agree completely with Gordon and Ann, we need to be more assertive in pressing our partners in the region to support what we believe are our critical interests. Our interest is seeing a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Libya, of the civil war there, of allowing the UN process to work through. And we now have allies fighting on both sides. We have the Turks who are in Tripoli fighting with for the government. And then we have the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Saudis on the other side supporting the Haftar people. And we really need to put down markers that this is unacceptable to us and that we need everyone to get behind the international law, the UN Security Council resolutions, and the UN process in order to bring an end to this really destructive civil war.
Ambassador Firestein, I'm going to save us a little bit of time. We have about 10 minutes left, and there's two questions. The next two questions are coming to you specifically, one from Bozeman and one from Capitol. The first is, do you think Yemen is any closer to reaching an agreement than they were in 2014? That came from Alice. And then another one to you is, when and how do you expect the civil war in Yemen to end? That was from Sella.
Okay, thanks for both of those questions. What I would say is that regrettably, no, I don't think that Yemen is closer to a successful political transition now than they were 7 years ago. I think that the situation that we're in right now, in my view, needs to be triaged. We need to prioritize the way we approach this. The most important thing, in my view, is to end the fighting between the Houthis and the government with the Saudi-led coalition. We need to restore some kind of a calm in the country that allows people to get their lives back in order. There needs to be an effort by the international community to really come to grips with this humanitarian catastrophe, to ensure that there's enough food, fuel, medicine, to get the basic institutions of government, health and education functioning again, so that people can get their lives back in some semblance of order. And then, only then, after that, can we go back and start working again on these political issues that the Yemenis have been trying to resolve really again for 60 years. To look at the National Dialogue Conference and the over 1,600 recommendations they made. Some of them may be good, some of them may be not good, but there needs to be some kind of an understanding of what the Yemeni people want to do to go forward, and then hopefully get back to a situation where you can have elections and bring in a really representative government. So we're talking about a very long-term process of reconstruction, rehabilitation in Yemen. And again, I think it's important for the United States to recognize that we're going to have to remain engaged, not for a year or two. This can't be, I think all of us know Tim Lenderking, the new special envoy. We think extremely well of him. He's a very well qualified diplomat, very experienced, extremely knowledgeable. But this can't just be about Tim Lenderking getting a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. It's got to be a commitment to standing by the Yemenis while they rebuild. And what was the other question?
About specifically the Civil War.
Oh, how will it end? You know, we're at an intersection here, and it's going to be very important how we go forward. Again, Tim Lenderking is working very hard. President Biden gave him clear instructions to work very closely with the UN, with Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, to try to come up with a political agreement to end the war. And that's going to be a hard lift. Unfortunately, the initial response of the parties after the president's announcement has not been very reassuring. The Houthis in particular have used this opportunity to expand their conflict inside of Yemen, as well as to launch new attacks across the border into Saudi Arabia. And the question is whether or not they understood that President Biden was offering them an opportunity to get a diplomatic resolution, or did they see this as a sign of US weakness and uncertainty that it's going to allow them to achieve a military victory that they haven't been able to achieve? It's very important for the United States to make clear that it's the former, not the latter, to get the parties back to the negotiating table, to come up with a government that can go back into Sana'a that will reflect all of the different parties and all of the different interests, but to get them back to Sana'a so that, again, they can begin working on this phased process that I had just outlined.
Okay, Ambassador Patterson, we've got a question from Jacqueline for you, and if there's time, we'll go to Gardner. And Gardner, you have a couple questions in the queue. I apologize if we don't get there, but Jacqueline, let's go to you for Ambassador Patterson.
Hi, yeah, so I was going to ask, can you explain or describe more on Egypt's current government or president? Are they a step up from the former presidents, and have they been more helpful in meeting civilian needs?
Well, basically what you have is a military dictatorship. President al-Sisi has eliminated all opposition. He's a military dictator. So the picture is mixed. Certainly on the political side and the standpoint of free speech and what we think of as political liberties, those have been pretty much eliminated. On the economic side, he's had some successes, at least in the macro sense. He's discovered gas fields, or the Egyptian government's discovered gas fields. They've had an IMF agreement and they've made progress on that. The problem with that, though, is the burden of these adjustments often falls on the poorest of the poor. So it's a mixed picture. Most people say that under President Mubarak, there was a greater degree of social and political freedom, that's been virtually eliminated. But I do think they've made some progress on the economic side. But again, the long-term unemployment and the youth bulge, it's really hard to see the way out of that.
Thanks, Ambassador. And Rex, I apologize, or Gardner, I apologize. Rex called me out and told me that I missed him. And so I am going to go back to him. I was doing a dang good job until the very end, but we're going to go to Hellgate for Rex.
Thank you. I want to ask kind of a question that summarizes the conversation, I think. What can we as students do to help these efforts to lift the Arab world out of poverty and to democratize the Middle East? Like, should we write letters to our representatives and senators? Should we donate to charities, or should we pursue careers in diplomacy like you all have? Do you feel like you've made a difference yourselves with your careers?
Ambassadors, I think I will go to all three of you again, and I think this is an awesome way to close. Rex, nice job, because I think this is a great way to end.
I would say, by all means, consider careers in diplomacy. It's a wonderful career. I think all of us and all of our colleagues have enjoyed it a great deal. I would say also that it's important to share your views with your elected representatives, be it on the Middle East, North Africa, or any other issue. At the same time, certainly one of the lessons I learned throughout my diplomatic career was the importance of humility. And what I mean by that is understanding that the United States is a great power, and we've been able to accomplish a great deal. But at the same time, it's very, very, very difficult to change societies. So it's important to have patience and a long-term view and vision.
That's a great question. And I think the answer is to talk to your friends and neighbors and talk about how important what goes on in the Arab world or Latin America or anywhere else is important to the United States and to people in Montana. Egypt is the world's largest importer of American wheat. Southern states sell huge amounts of agricultural products to the Arab world and elsewhere. Terrorism affects us all. Pandemics affect us all that start overseas. So it's important to have a robust, for a great power like the United States, a robust overseas presence, military, diplomatic, assistance in every respect. So just keep studying and look at careers in the foreign affairs agencies, but also to your friends and neighbors, talk up that message.
Yeah, and let me say just at the end, obviously, of course, everything that Gordon and Ann said is true. The simple answer to your question is all of the above. Being engaged with humanitarian organizations is great. Writing and making sure that Congress knows how you feel about these things is great. And if you're so moved, like Ann and Gordon, I couldn't think of anything I would have rather spent my life doing than working in diplomacy and working on these issues. But let me also just turn it back on you, and just to make the point that I was in your shoes over 50 years ago, and I can tell you that when I was in your shoes, I probably didn't know 1% about the world that you guys have demonstrated over these last 90 minutes. And I think it's just so fabulous that you're sitting there and you're tracking these things and you're interested in this stuff. You're already so far ahead of where, earlier generations of Americans were. And so I think, congratulations to you. And I hope that this is the beginning of a long, lifelong love affair with the rest of the world.
As a brief follow-up to that, how did you three get your starts in diplomacy when you were young idealists?
Ann and I can tell you a story, but I'll let Ann go first because she has the best one.
So I graduated from college and I went home, and it was the summer. And my mother sees an advertisement in a magazine about the Foreign Service test. And it says, the Foreign Service needs women. And my mother says to me, you're not doing anything, go, and you don't have a job, go take this test. And for me, I'd never been particularly interested in international affairs. I'd studied domestic issues in college. But again, it was a wonderful experience. And I urge you all to investigate it. But that's how I got in.
Yeah, and like Ann, I had I was finishing up, I was getting my master's degree, I was coming to the end of my course of studies. I didn't really know what I was going to do. A friend of mine was coming down to take the Foreign Service exam. They said, why don't you come with? I did. I got in. My friend didn't. And it was a fabulous 40 years after that.
I was slightly more intentional than that. I joined the Peace Corps, loved the Peace Corps. When I found out that the US government would pay me a modest salary to learn a language and they'd pay for my travel, I said, sign me up, and never looked back, never regretted it.
Okay, this is Greg again with Inspired Classroom, and you guys, ambassadors, this has been tremendous. And at Inspired Classroom, we do, and with the World Affairs Council, we're promoting this idea of using video conferencing technology. It's just a real pleasure for me as a former social studies teacher to hear all this stuff. But not only that, but just to see your reactions as we communicate. You guys had some fun today, and the kids, awesome questions and an awesome job. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I mean, what a great way to end it up. And for me, it just says, look, we all come from different walks of life. We can come into this from different places, but the U.S. Foreign Service and working internationally, you know, it needs a lot of different kinds of people. And so those of you who are out there across Montana who are interested in this kind of thing, go for it, just like the ambassadors said. So let me now just thank you very sincerely, Ambassadors Patterson, Firestein, and Gray, for coming to us and lending your perspective and your experience, not just on the issue of the Arab Spring, but obviously it was much more broad than that. And we just can't thank you enough for beaming into and across Montana today. Really sincerely appreciate it. Greg, again, another excellent facilitation from you and Inspired Classrooms. Thank you so much. Very quickly looking ahead at 12:15, teachers, we have our second of 3 OPI course credit classes with our friends from the U.S. Institute of Peace. That's at 12:15. Then at 1:30, we'll be joined by Ambassador Hisham Yusuf, a former Egyptian ambassador now working with the U.S. Institute of Peace, to talk a little bit more about peace in times of conflict. So a great way to end up the day, obviously. And then we've got 2 more days of events coming up. So thank you again to our ambassador guests. Thank you, Inspired Classrooms. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.